Welcome to the Maternal Wealth Podcast, your space for all things maternal health, pregnancy, birth, and beyond. I am Stephanie Terrio, a labor and delivery nurse and a mother to 3 beautiful boys. Each week, we dive into inspiring stories and expert insights to remind us of your power in giving birth and motherhood. We're here to explore the joys, the challenges, and the complexities of maternal health. Because every mother's journey is unique and every story deserves to be told. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to replace professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with your healthcare provider for medical guidance tailored to your specific needs. Are you ready? Let's get into it. Good morning and welcome to the Maternal Wealth Podcast. I reached out to a local moms group in Beverly, and Courtney was eager to share her story. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here too. I'm excited to hear your stories, your journey into pregnancy, the birth of Chandler and Elliot, and all of the good stuff in between. Would you like to share with us a little bit about who you are and your family?
Sure. We live in Peabody. My wife and I are both nannies. That's actually how we met. And we have a 5-year-old and a 17-month-old. And I started out as a single mom by choice with my older daughter. And then my now partner and I got together, and then we decided we wanted to have another baby. And, we're just trying to survive and break all the cycles.
Yeah.
Just making sure that, it's such a hard balance, right? You're like, are they having a good childhood? Am I spoiling them too much? Am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're just, out here with us and our 3 cats that we now have. And, we like to do all sorts of good stuff. We like to be outside a lot. In the summer, we like to go camping.
Okay.
Just trying to push through,
Yeah, like all of us.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your journey getting pregnant with Chandler and the pregnancy and delivery and all of that good stuff.
As I mentioned, I had Chandler originally as a single mom by choice. I had dated some in the past, and it was never really something that I was, to be honest, I never really craved a relationship. It was more of like, oh yeah, I want to have babies, so I guess I should date. And then at some point it kind of dawned on me. I was like, well, that's not a great reason to want to date somebody. I was like, I can just kind of do it myself. And I had always joked as I got older, I was like, oh, well, if a relationship doesn't work out, I have the uterus, so I can just, do it on my own. And I kind of realized that was honestly more of a plan A for me. And so, I looked into different donors, and I ended up picking one, and I did 2 IUIs, which is intrauterine insemination. And the second one worked, and I had kind of a tough pregnancy with her. I was lucky. I had definitely a good support system. My parents and my family they weren't really concerned with how I started building my family. They were just happy to have a new family member coming in, and my friends were all very supportive. So I definitely felt like I had a good village. And I was never diagnosed in my first pregnancy with hyperemesis, but I was definitely very, very sick and was on Zofran, and it helped for a while, and then it kind of tapered off, and it was just like, all right, this is how it's going to be. And then around 26, 27 weeks, my blood pressure started to spike, and so I had gestational hypertension, and I had to try. It was hard. I was nannying at the time about 50 hours a week, so I had to kind of balance resting with also taking care of a 2.5 and a 1-year-old.
Did you say 50, 50?
50, yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Pregnant and taking care of the kids. Yes.
Yeah. It was definitely, I was on the border for most of my pregnancy, and just kind of checking my blood pressure and making sure I wasn't I didn't end up having to take any medication during my pregnancy, but they decided for my safety and for the baby that they'd induce me around 37 weeks. So my induction was on a Monday, so I worked up until that Friday. Then went in and did the induction, and I was expecting it to take days, and it actually only took about from start to finish 19 hours. It was definitely I mean, I had never given birth, right? So I wasn't quite sure what to expect. They started me out with misoprostol, which I didn't have a great reaction to. Once the contraction started, they just kind of never ended.
Okay.
So it was just one long, big contraction. And overall, the labor was okay. But then once the baby came out, there was meconium that came out right before she was born. And
Okay.
nobody really knows why she came out like this, but she came out and she was pretty unresponsive. Her first APGAR was a 1. So they like put her on
Okay.
me really quick, and then they had like the NICU team there. I was just kind of in like a daze and
Yeah.
just watching her waiting for, I'm like, aren't they supposed to cry? Like what's,
Yeah.
and so I think it was like probably, I have to like kind of look back at like one of my friends was at the birth and she was taking a lot of pictures. So I kind of have to like piece it together by looking at the pictures. And I think, they put her on me and then they took her to work on her. And then about 10 minutes later, they gave her back to me for a couple
Okay.
minutes. And then they wanted to bring her up to the special care nursery. My mom was there. So she went up and kind of with her just to have someone be with her. And
Right.
at some point, probably like an hour or so later, the doctor from the NICU came down and said that they were going to have to transfer her to children's. And a lot of this in the moment, I was like, okay, whatever. Like, I had just given birth. Actually, right after I delivered, I developed preeclampsia. So it really wasn't until like weeks, months later that I kind of pieced together everything that had happened. She had what's called HIE. Basically means that like her brain was deprived of oxygen. So they wanted to bring her to children's to do what's called a cooling treatment because the thought is if they bring her temperature down, almost like putting something on ice, right? Like they wanted to try to stop any swelling on her brain. So they brought her to children's and they do the cooling treatment. They like bring her temperature down about 4 degrees for 72 hours, I think. And then they slowly warm her up over the course of 12 hours. And then they do an MRI. And thankfully, once they did that, the MRI came back normal. So it looked like there wasn't any major brain damage or anything. And then while this was happening, I had to go in magnesium for 24 hours after I had her because the preeclampsia developed. Fortunately, I gave birth on a Tuesday. So Wednesday and Thursday, they let me leave the hospital and come back. So I was able to go to Children's to see her for a few hours. And then that Friday, my blood pressure went back up. So I had to go back down to labor and delivery and, get all these meds. So she was at Children's for about 4 days. Then she was able to come back to the Beverly Special Care Nursery. She was stable enough, which I felt grateful for. And so she was there for, I think, 8 more days, just kind of, learning all the newborn things that she had kind of missed out on because she had gone through this traumatic event.
Yeah.
And thankfully, she was really healthy afterwards, and she was able to come home with me with no long lasting damage. And I think at the time, I just really kind of disassociated. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, this is just what we're doing. And then, a few months later, a couple years later, I was like, oh, that was actually very traumatic. And I think also, like, I had a lot of support, but I think being that it was just me, I was just kind of like, okay, this is, I guess, just what I have to do. And so I just kind of like powered through, not kind of focusing on any of that, right? I was like, okay, this is what we're doing and it's fine. And then as time went on, I was like, oh, that actually was not that great of an experience. But I was definitely grateful, that she ended up being healthy and met all her milestones. And there are some behavior things that sometimes I wonder if it's attributed to the HIE because there's so many different things. I know some people who are autistic because that it can cause, or not cause, but like attribute to autism or ADHD or anything. So it's definitely something that we kind of just keep an eye on, but overall just feel very lucky that we were able to make it out the way that we did. And during this time, my partner Jen, who at the time was just like my friend, she was very helpful and supportive and was kind of like a big part of my village. Like she was the first one when they brought Chandler back from children. She was the first one to see her along with me, which was really nice. And I always joke that like Chandler was destined to become hers because she had come to see me and she had to go to work. And so as she's leaving, the NICU nurse is like, bye, congratulations. And she didn't quite hear her. So she was like, thank you. And I was like, yeah, she was like supposed to be yours.
Oh, that gives me goosebumps to hear
Yeah.
that. That's so sweet.
And I was always like, oh, this is like her second mom. And now I'm like, oh, yeah, that's just her mom now. And then after Chandler came home, she would come and do some overnights for me so I could sleep, which was really helpful. And yeah, she was just like a big part of her life. And she was kind of like an aunt figure, right? She was like her auntie. And then as time went on, over like a year or two, we just were really close. And neither of us were necessarily had never been in a relationship with a woman and thought about it, but we were like, oh, this is like a very nice situation that we have going on here. Like, we're really happy together. We work together really well. And it's very non-traditional. And I think it took a lot of people around us time, not that they didn't accept it, but they just kind of didn't understand it. They were like, what do you mean you're like just in a relationship with your friend? And we're like, I don't know. This is just what works for us. And we're a family. And so she had moved in when Chandler was like probably a little under 2. And we had talked before and after about wanting to add to our family. And I had said throughout my entire pregnancy with Chandler and the few months after, I was like, I'm never doing this again. This was terrible. This was like such a terrible experience. I was so sick. And then this is why people have children and more children, because you forget how it is. And so as we were talking, I was like, I think I'd like to do it one more time. I'd really like to try and have a redeeming birth experience. And obviously that's not the only reason, but I definitely wanted to have, like, there was so much I missed out on, right? Like the golden hour and those early breastfeeding days and coming home at the same time as your baby. Jen is 10 years younger than me, so we figured that like we could have maybe 2 more children. So I would have the second one, and then she could have it because she had a lot more time. And so when Chandler was about a little over 3, we had decided to start trying. And we again did 2 IUIs, and the second one worked. So we were super excited about that for about the first 2 weeks. And then we had already planned a trip to Disney. So we went to Disney. We had a great time. I'll never forget this. It was the last day, and I was taking a shower, and I immediately started to feel so nauseous. And I was like, oh, here it comes. And then it just really went downhill from there. I was just so sick. I couldn't keep anything down. I like could barely move. I was like, this is so terrible. Thankfully, we had another friend who was pregnant, and she didn't have like to the extreme that I did, but she had Zofran, and I was like, girl, you have got to bring me a Zofran before I can get in with my OB. Like, I need some help. With both my pregnancies, around 5 weeks or so was when the nausea really started to hit. And that second time around was just so bad. I think 6 weeks is the first time I went to the ER because I was like, I like can't eat anything. I can't drink anything. I'm so dehydrated. So we went to the ER, got some fluids. I didn't feel great afterwards, but it was fine. And then I was able to check in with one of the midwives at the practice that we were seeing. And she was like, if the next time, if you feel like you have to go to the ER, I had gone to the one closest to home, but I was planning to give birth at Mount Auburn. So she was like, come here, we might admit you. So a few days later, I was like, I'm so sick, I can't do this. So went to the ER and ended up staying there for, I think, 3 days, trying to get fluids in me and the meds correct. It was definitely rough. And there was definitely a time where I was like, I don't know that I can do this. We wanted this pregnancy. It was very much wanted and tried for. And even Jen, she was like, I will do anything. She's like, if you want me, I'll drive you to the clinic. And I joke, I'm like, I really appreciate your support, Jen, but we spent about $2,000 on this baby. I think that we should see it through. It was so hard, right? And then she had to kind of take the brunt of everything else because it was all I could do to just kind of survive.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel really lucky. I had a really great team. I was seeing midwives this time, and this one midwife in particular, it's just very validating. And my previous pregnancy, they gave me some Zofran, but it was really like, okay, well, if the Zofran's not working, then I guess that's just how it is. And
Okay.
this time around, it was like, okay, let's try this medicine and let's see if this combination works or if this. And honestly, nothing worked, but it was just nice to feel validated in the fact that they saw how hard it was and they were, trying. So it was just a really, really nice experience as far as like care team goes.
For your first pregnancy, who was your birth providers? Did you have an OBGYN team or midwifery team?
I started with a midwifery team. I started it at the birth center because it was still open.
Okay.
And then once my blood pressure started to get too high, I risked out. So then I went and saw the OBs there. But this time around, I was like, I'd really like, if possible, to see a midwife. And where I did the IUI, it was very low intervention. And so the midwives were actually the ones that did it. And so I was like, this is like a great practice. I'd actually really like to see them. First IUI we did was the midwife I ended up seeing through my entire pregnancy. And she ended up delivering my daughter, which was like a very full circle moment.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
The nausea, it never went away. I never felt good, but it wasn't as dire as that like first trimester. So I just kind of trudged through it. It was hard on I wouldn't say it's hard on our relationship, but it was definitely one of the hardest things that Jen and I ever had to do because it was just, I was just trying to like survive and work as much as I could, but it wasn't really a lot. And then Jen kind of took the brunt and was doing a lot of care for Chandler and most things around the house. And it was like, oh, we wanted to be so happy and enjoy this. And it was just such a hard time that it really made it difficult to do that. Thankfully, my blood pressure was pretty stable throughout this pregnancy. I started taking baby aspirin. So up until about like 36 or 37 weeks, everything kind of looked good. And then my plan had been to induce at 39 weeks electively because I was just so miserable. I was like, I actually can't do this anymore. But around 37 weeks, my blood pressure started to get a little high. And it was right around Memorial Day. I was like, I know it's 90 degrees out, but my feet are looking very swollen. And so I had gone a couple days later and my blood pressure was high. So I went to triage and they kind of, checked me out and the baby out. And I wasn't quite ready, right? I wanted to be done being pregnant, but I was like, oh, this is, once it starts happening, you're like, oh, I'm actually not quite ready yet. So thankfully I was able to go home. I had an appointment with my midwife the next day and she checked my blood pressure and she was like, yeah, I think you should probably just go to the hospital. So I called Jen and she was at work and I was like, okay, we're actually having a baby right now. So you need to come home. And her boss was on maternity leave. She had a baby about 2 months before we had Elliot. So she was home, thankfully. And so she had the middle son and she just went home and like tossed him at her. She's like, okay, see you later.
My turn.
Yeah, I gotta go. I mean, I was like done being pregnant, right? But like it just felt I was like, I'm not ready for this. Wasn't in the plan. So it took a minute to get used to, right? When you go expecting like, okay, maybe in a few days we'll have a baby and they're like, no, you should go have it now.
Yeah.
Like, okay. So we, came back, said goodbye to Chan, and my dad was living with us at the time, which was helpful because he was there and he was able to take care of her. So we didn't have to worry about that. I knew going in, based on my last birth, that I didn't want to use miso in the induction because I felt like I had a bad reaction. And I always wondered if that kind of had an effect on my birth outcome, just because I know that the contractions were kind of nonstop and definitely put a little bit of distress on the
Mm-hmm.
baby. So I had mentioned that up front early in my pregnancy. I was like, I don't want to use this if possible. Another thing I really appreciated about my birth team this time around was how much they put that birth trauma at the front and how much that kind of paved the way for how they cared for me and how they wanted this experience to go for me. So, which was really nice. So we went in and started the induction, and I did Cervidil,
Okay.
and then they did like the Foley balloon, and this one took longer, but it was, it was fine with me. Overall, it was like a better birth
Mm-hmm.
experience. With Chandler, I had my mom and a couple friends, and they were great supports, but I think being there with a partner was definitely a very different experience, right? And we had a doula, and we didn't end up calling her to come in until I had already gotten my epidural,
Mm-hmm.
because it was just like a really nice experience, just the two of us getting ready to like have this experience of like welcoming this new baby together, and it was so exciting. And the birth was pretty uneventful, like it was painful obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely went a lot better according to plan. It took a while, and then the midwife that I had been working with the whole time, she had come in around like 8 o'clock. I had been there like since 2 o'clock the previous day, and she came in, and I was on Pitocin at that point, and then I ended up getting an epidural. And I have always been very pro epidural, but for some reason in my head I was like, oh, I have to wait until I'm however far along because I don't want it to slow down, right? And I was
Mm-hmm.
like 3.5, 4, and I was like, yeah, I can't. Like, I gotta get the epidural. So I
Mm-hmm.
got it, and I actually think that's exactly what my body needed, because I got the epidural, and then she was born 4 or 5 hours later. My water broke on its own, which was kind of a cool experience because they had broken my water in my first pregnancy. It was like 4 or 5 hours after I got the epidural, and it was a good epidural. I was like, oh, this is lovely. So I was like, I think I'm feeling like a little bit of pressure, like maybe just come have her check me. And so she came in, she was like, oh yeah, the baby's right there. She was at +3. So everyone got ready, and I pushed twice. We really wanted Jen to like catch her. So Jen and the midwife caught her,
Oh,
and we
that's
didn't know
nice.
what she was either. We kept the gender a secret the whole
Oh,
time,
okay.
which was really fun. We
Mm-hmm.
were convinced it was a boy. So she, put her on me, and it was probably like 30 or 40 seconds. And I was like, oh, wait, what is it? And she kind of lifted her up, and she was like, oh, it's a girl. Yeah, it was just so nice. I had been taking an SSRI, so they had warned me, like, we'll have the pediatrician here just in case. And it definitely wasn't like the birth my first, but after a few minutes they brought her over to the warmer just to get her settled. And I was like, oh, in my head I was like, oh God, not again. And thankfully my midwife was really on my team, and I think they were doing their thing for a couple minutes, and she went over there and she was like, they have birth trauma, you better figure it out and get that baby back over. Which was very helpful. And then she came over, and we got to do the whole golden hour, which was so great. And our doula was there and helped us with breastfeeding. And it was just all this stuff that I had missed with my first. I had just kind of disassociated, right, with my first. And this was like this pure joy that you're like, oh my God, I can't believe, especially because we had such a hard pregnancy. Like, we finally did it.
Mm-hmm.
Those first few days, and you're in the hospital just with you, and you're just like so happy. I had a little bit of a tough recovery. Like, she came out fast, and I was also so sick that I just had nothing left. I don't know if this is TMI, but I just kind of like broke. Everything was just like, it took like probably an hour or so for them to kind of like sew me up. And I had
Mm-hmm.
asked my midwife a few weeks later, I was like, oh, how many stitches? She's like, I don't know, but that was one of the most complicated repairs that I'd had in a while. And I was like, okay. But it was just such a different postpartum experience too, right? Like, I was able to actually rest and recover. And I recommend everybody have a baby with a woman personally. She was just so, not that husbands aren't great, but she's just like a really amazing partner. And it was just so nice to be able to like focus on the baby and recovering, and it was just like such a different experience.
Earlier, you mentioned that you wanted to have a redeeming birth experience. And do you feel like that's what you got?
I do. You're always like, oh, I could do it better. I could do this. But yeah, I think it was definitely what I was looking for. And it was just, I had like a great team and a great partner. And, she was with us the whole time, the baby. And it was definitely what I had been looking for and missed from that first birth.
I find in that moment in the birth experience, a good birth, it validates everything is going to be okay. It's just such a surreal, humbling experience. There's not even really words to describe exactly how it feels or what it is. It's like taking a deep breath and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, it's just, there's nothing. It's funny. I said throughout both my pregnancies, I was like, I'm never doing this again. And now I'm like sad that I'm never doing it again. And Jen's like, I will leave you if you try to have another baby. Like, that was terrible. But I mean, pregnancy, I'm not good at, but I really enjoyed giving birth. Obviously, it's physically painful and mentally challenging, but it's just so empowering.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, men could never, but
No.
you just feel like, wow, I can't believe
Mm-hmm.
that I just did this. Like, you just ran this like 100-mile marathon and huge physical feat that you just did. And it's just amazing.
It really is. I want to talk about the cervidil and the meso, right? The cytotec.
Yeah.
With the first pregnancy, you mentioned that they gave you the meso and you had one long contraction.
Yeah.
You can have a prolonged contraction, which a contraction just keeps going and going and going.
Yeah.
And did you have something like that? Or did you have contractions like back to back to back to back for an extended period of time, or both?
I think it was like like I didn't feel any break. Like, it just felt like once the cramping started, it just kind of never ended.
Okay.
And I actually didn't realize, I had always assumed that they put me on Pitocin. I was like, oh yeah. And it wasn't until like 2 years later, I was just reading through my notes and I was like, oh, they never even put me on Pitocin because they didn't need to.
Did they give you the misoprostol vaginally or was it oral?
It was vaginally, and they just gave me one dose, and then they did the balloon. And at some point, it's all like a little blurry, but at some point they did give me terbutaline, I think, to kind of slow the contractions down a little bit. There was never any moment where they were like, oh, her heartbeat's really dropping, but I think they could tell she was like a little distressed. Oh, I forgot to mention, during my second pregnancy, when I first started the induction, I had asked, is there a way that I could get Zofran, like an IV of Zofran, because I've been nauseous this whole time. They were like, oh, sure, absolutely. And, we hadn't even started the cervidil yet. And the nurse came in, gave me the Zofran, and I had like this huge contraction and felt very, very hot. And I was like, that is different. I've had a lot of IV Zofran throughout this pregnancy and never felt like that. And then about 5 minutes later, all of these people come running in and start putting oxygen on me and, doing all this stuff. And Jen was like, what did you give her? And the nurse accidentally gave me 10 milliliters of Pitocin through the IV instead of Zofran. Their terbutaline is what jogged my memory of that, because they gave me that. And then we kind of had to wait a couple hours to see if the baby's heartbeat slowed down. This kind of goes to the like trauma-informed care. I had a nurse the night before in triage, and we had just been going through history, and I had been talking to her about my previous birth and how it was traumatic. And she wasn't my nurse when I went in for my induction, but she was working. So when that happened and everyone kind of came in, one nurse is giving me oxygen, the midwife's doing the terbutaline, and this nurse that I had the day before came in, and I remember her looking right at me, and she was like, you're safe, the baby is safe, you're going to be okay. It was just so nice to feel like I was kind of seen, and like she knew that it was really important to know that my baby was safe, because she knew the experience that I had the previous time. I think of that a lot, because it was just such a nice gesture. After a little while, the baby's heartbeat slowed down, and so we were able to kind of go back as normal. And me, I'm like, it's okay, everything's fine. And Jen's like, do not tell them it's okay. And I'm like, sorry, I asked for the medicine. That was totally my bad. Like, it's fine.
We internalize and say, I'm sorry, when really there's no fault on our part.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying about healthcare providers taking the time and practicing trauma-based care is so important because sometimes we're so caught up in the moment. There's an acute problem right now that we need to resolve. And one of the things that I take with me is there's two patients essentially, what's going on the vitals and on the fetal strip and trying to take care of all of that. And then there's a human being, right? So
Yes.
taking the time to step away from looking at the computer or looking at the numbers and talking to the human being
Yes.
and having that connection. Was it a nurse who was?
It was a nurse. Yeah.
Yeah, having the nurse or the birth provider look at you in a calming voice and explaining what's going on and saying that everything is okay in this moment. So it's nice to hear that somebody provided that for you.
Yeah. It was very nice. And she came in after and we were kind of talking. So that always kind of sticks out in my mind.
You mentioned getting the term, the
Mhm.
injection to stop the contractions.
Yeah.
It's important for our listeners to hear if somebody is in labor or if they have the induction and they're getting the Pitocin or the Cytotec and there's too many contractions that you might have been having or a prolonged contraction, then it's a little injection. Did they give it to you in your arm?
Yeah. I think it was in my arm.
So it's just a little sub-Q injection that goes in the fatty tissue to help stop the contractions. And it happens pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'll tell the patient it can make your heart race or you feel like fluttering in your heart. Did you experience that?
Honestly, I can't remember. I know the baby's heart rate went up. There were a few times it was in the 200s,
Okay.
but right around the 2 hour mark. I think actually the midwife said that they had the OB come look and then she was fine. And
Okay.
he was like, "Oh, why am I looking at this?" She's like, "I swear it was just very high." But she's like, "I'm fine now." Mine might have, but honestly, I kind of forget.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the difference between getting the Cytotec and the Cervidil, right? So in your
Yeah.
second pregnancy, these are both medications that help ripen or soften the cervix before you're augmented. You get the Pitocin.
Hmm.
So what was your experience with the Cervidil?
That one was much better. I know that one takes a little bit longer, but I was just
Mm-hmm.
like really wanting to avoid. And actually, they had suggested maybe trying to just start with the balloon, but I just like wasn't quite dilated enough, so we started with the Cervidil. And there was like cramping, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't anything. It came and it went, and sitting in the tub helped, in the
Mm-hmm.
shower, and that was definitely a better experience. It
Mm-hmm.
That was like what I had been expecting the first time around. Here's a contraction. Okay, now it's gone, and like here's another one, and it was like slow
Mm-hmm.
and steady as opposed to like just kind of all at once, just this unrelenting pain.
Mm-hmm. With the Cervidil, it's also placed vaginally, right? And it's a
Hmm.
little string that's placed against the cervix, and generally it's left in for 12 hours. After the 12-hour mark, it will come out. The contrast between the Cervidil and the misoprostol cost. Some hospitals don't offer the Cervidil because of budget and the cost.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the Cervidil is more expensive. One other thing that I wanted to mention with the Cervidil that I generally like in practice is Cervidil can come out. So Cervidil's on a string, it goes in the vagina up against the cervix. If the baby is not loving the contractions or contracting too much, the provider can take the Cervidil out and effectively stop the contractions as opposed to the misoprostol or the Cytotec. Once it's in, it's in. It's a pill. It's absorbed into the system.
Yeah.
So then, like you said, it was a lot for your body, for the baby. So you got the terbutaline to stop that. So different variations of how providers practice induction methods and the effects that it can have on the patient.
Yeah. I also had the Foley balloon both times, and I know a lot of people have really unpleasant experiences with that. And the first time around, I was like, oh God, this is going to be terrible. Like everyone talks about how awful it was. And I think it really depends on the individual because I don't know if it made my contractions worse, but I didn't have anything to compare it to. But like the actual placement was fine. And then, I mean, it wasn't, the contractions after weren't pleasant, but definitely were manageable. So I was like definitely nervous in the first time. And then I was like, oh, that actually wasn't as bad as I was thinking.
One of the ways that I like to look at the cervical balloon placement is you're exactly right. Some people, they have a lot harder time than other people. And if you think about a cervix, if it's closed, if your effacement is 0, you're long, thick, and closed, like it's tissue, it's tight, right?
Yeah.
So there are some providers who will say any cervix is balloonable. So whether you're closed or open slightly and a little soft, and they'll place it. And if you think about kind of tissue, if it's a little bit more soft or a little bit more open, putting a catheter in there is not going to be as painful, right? So if you're long, thick, and closed and they put the catheter in there, then it's a lot more uncomfortable. That also varies in providers' practice. Maybe, I mean, we don't know specifically for your case, but I do find if you wait a little bit and soften the cervix and let it dilate just a tiny bit, then it's not as uncomfortable.
They tried initially, and then she was like, yeah, I just don't think you have, like, you're dilated enough. I can appreciate that. I was like, yeah, no, it's fine. Let's just do the Cervidil and then kind of go from there. So I'm sure that made a difference too.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely what I've seen in my practice, working with different providers and different hospital policies and with different patients too.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit, if you're comfortable, when you say IUI, I think a lot of our listeners might have heard IUI, but do you want to talk a little bit how that experience was for you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think a lot of people I know are familiar with IVF, but I think they're less familiar with IUI. A lot of times if cis couples use IUI, it's because they've been trying to have a baby naturally, and it obviously is taking some time. Most times they'll do a medicated IUI, and you'll take Clomid. You'll take that like the first day of your cycle or something. I didn't actually do medicated, so I'm not 100% sure on that. But I started out kind of basic. Everything seems to check out. I don't have any reason to think that I needed anything more. So it was basically just putting the sperm where it needed to go, and it wasn't any more invasive than a pap smear. Like they just put the speculum in, and they have like a very, very small catheter, and they just put the sperm through there. And sometimes if you go through a fertility clinic, they'll do some monitoring, and they'll kind of tell you, where you are in your cycle, and they'll have you come in at a certain time. And where I did it was much less intervention. So basically I just like tracked my ovulation, and when I got a peak, I called them and I said, I got a peak at this time, and they said, okay, come in, tomorrow or whatever. So I went in, they put the little catheter in through the cervix to get the sperm to the uterus, and then that was it. I think a lot of people are like, oh, will you have like, are you more likely to have twins that way or this? And if it's not medicated, it's no different than, you know, naturally having a child with your husband. I just didn't have one, right? So I needed someone to put the sperm where it belonged. So there's definitely different levels and different levels of intervention. Some people do it at home, but I was like, I want like a professional to be doing this because sperm is not cheap. Um, and thankfully, both times it only took 2 times.
I'm not as familiar as to how many times generally it will take, but do you know if maybe after 2 times people move on to the next step, or
I
they
think
keep trying?
the first time around, I think they had told me like, oh, let's give it 3 tries. If it doesn't work, then we can kind of talk about like adding medication. When I got pregnant with Chan, I was 34, close to turning 35. When I got pregnant with Elliot, I was 38, close to turning 39. I always tend to panic and get frantic. So after the first one didn't work, I had called the midwife and I was like, do we think that we should do medicated or this and that? And she said, let's do one more. If this one doesn't work, then we can try like a medicated cycle. It also depends a lot on like the sperm too, right? I didn't realize this until afterwards, but the donor that I picked had very prolific sperm. a lot of people have used the same donor. There's 44 kids. So I'm like, oh yeah, he had some pretty strong sperm. And I know people who have like one donor sibling. And a lot of people who use the same donor, it also worked on the first try. It obviously depends on your own fertility. He had some very strong swimmers. So I think that helped a lot too.
Do you have any advice for our listeners who might be thinking of having a child by choice? Do you have any advice for them for going forward with their decision? And if they do get pregnant, advice for their pregnancy and the birth experience?
I'm obviously there's times where like it might not be in anybody's best interest to have a kid, right? Like if you're not financially, whether you're in a couple or whatnot, if you're waiting for a partner just because you think that that's what you should do. I personally really liked doing it on my own. Jen just kind of fell into my lap. It was a very like it made an ideal situation even more ideal, but it's very empowering to kind of know that like you don't have to wait for someone or something else to come along to like give you what you really want, right? And like you kind of take it into your own hands. I definitely recommend single mom by choice groups. There's some that meet in person. I never went to any, but there's a lot of different groups on Facebook, which I found really helpful, especially in like the beginning when I was trying. There's like a triers page and like a just, general, and it's really helpful to talk. I always recommend that. It's really helpful to talk to people who have gone or are going through the same thing, and it's just a different experience, right? Even if you have friends who are doing fertility treatments, it's just a different experience doing it on your own. And it obviously is very helpful to have like a good support system. But if you don't, then you just, make your own. I mean, I was really lucky to have one. You can also kind of just put what you need in place, right? I do recommend just kind of thinking about it and, what are you going to do for childcare? And I was lucky that I was able to bring both my kids with me, particularly the first time. I don't think that I could have afforded daycare, but I think it really depends. And there's also a lot of services out there that you can get to help. If you make under a certain amount of money, you can apply. I know, at least in the state of Massachusetts, you can apply for a daycare voucher. So that is like super helpful. I mean, you want to try to be obviously as financially stable, but like everything's so expensive that you can only plan for so much, right? I think that if your biggest worry is that you just can't do it alone, I think you should go for it. If the only thing is that you think you should have a partner, just because that's the norm doesn't mean that's what's best for everyone. Or I know a lot of people who have great husbands and who are equal partners, but I also know a lot of people, particularly people see posting on the internet. They're married, but they're the ones doing the bulk of the work anyways. It's almost easier sometimes to just right, to just like kind of do it yourself. I see it a lot of times people, and I actually experience both sides. But I see on the single moms page sometimes they're like, oh, I have a friend, her husband's out of town. She's like, oh, I'm a single mom. It's so hard. And she's like, I do it all the time. And I can see both sides, because I think it's a lot different if you go into it and you're expecting to do it on your own. Whereas if you're expecting to have like a partner and then you have to do it on your own, it just feels different, right? I had my first on my own and it was like, oh yeah, I can totally do this. And then I went into the second one with a partner to rely on. So on the times where like I did it on my own, I was like, oh, I have to figure out how to do this. Even though I've like, one, I do it for a career, taking care of other people's children. And two, I had already done it. It's just different. But I think like there are a lot of people who might try and sway you and be like, oh, just try to wait it out and, the right person will come along. But like, just because that's how most people do it doesn't mean that that's how you have to do it. There are so many different ways to build a family. And I actually know through a few people that I kind of knew in my life also became single moms by choice, just like randomly. And then I've met some of them through local groups. It's definitely possible. And also finding community within that. In Massachusetts and in the North Shore, there's definitely a decent amount of single mom by choices. If you're not lucky enough to have a big support system in your life already, you can kind of create that. I think I just went off on a tangent, and I don't know if I even answered your question, but
You did. I was going to add that if we have listeners living in other parts of the country who are living in a community that isn't as supportive to women having children by choice, come to Massachusetts.
yes, yes, it's expensive, but well worth every
Yes.
penny, honestly.
I want to circle back to the redeeming birth experience because
Mm-hmm.
that really did resonate with me. What would you like to share to women who are listening to your story? You did have a traumatic birth experience and you opened yourself up to the possibility of having that redeeming birth. What advice or words would you like to share to women to try to have that redeeming birth experience?
I think it's really important to, especially when you have a traumatic birth with your first, you don't know what you don't know, right? So you just kind of go into it, and then, something happens. Sometimes these things just happen and you can't necessarily prevent them, but I think trying to seek out a team that is trauma informed and really behind you and wants to see you succeed and kind of understands. You don't want to let your first birth overshadow your second pregnancy, but I think you kind of want it to lead with that because your goal is. I mean, I think a lot of times people are like, "Oh, at the end of the day, as long as you have like a healthy mom and a healthy baby, that's all that's important." And like, yeah, that's important, but that's also should be like the bare minimum, right? Like
Right.
it it's important to have a good experience, and you don't want just healthy. You don't want it to be traumatic. So I think doulas can be really helpful. I think there are a lot of great OBs, but then I think there are some OBs that may push for certain things that maybe aren't necessary, or it can, just kind of really trying to be informed. There's always a balance too, right? Like you want to make sure that you're listening to the doctors, but then also kind of looking at the evidence too and making sure
Mhm.
that those two things line up. For me, the most important part was really that I had a good midwife and birth team in general, nurses included, that just wanted to help me succeed. And like talking about it in the beginning and being like, this is what my first birth experience was. And is there any way, looking back, do you think that there's anything we can do to kind of prevent that from happening? And just kind of looking at it from that lens. And just knowing that every birth is so different that like the fear that something is going to happen will always be there. But it can be a lot different and it can be so much better. Really, the providers play a huge role. You should be the one to run the ship, but like you need good providers. You don't necessarily have to see the same people you saw before, and you don't have to see the first person that you saw. If you go into your second pregnancy and you decide to see somebody and then you're like, I don't really get a good feeling from them, it's okay to switch. Just making sure that they are behind you and that you feel like that you're being heard and you're being like constantly kind of talking it out and just trying to like figure out how you can avoid that if possible, right? And something can always come up that it's very possible that you could have a redeeming birth.
I hear what you're saying in finding a team that hears you, that validates your birth trauma, that wants to empower you with this experience going forward is so important. And
Yeah.
like you said, like if you don't feel that, it's okay to move on, regardless at what point you are in the pregnancy. Even if you're at the hospital in it, there's always more than one provider in the hospital, right? So
Yeah.
having that support system that advocates for you, you can advocate for yourself and get that redeeming birth story.
Yeah. Which is hard. I mean, I say this like it's easy for me to say this, but in the moment, I'm such a people pleaser. I don't think a doula is 100% necessary, but I definitely think that if you can find a good doula, like they're really able to kind of help you to advocate for what you need, particularly in the moment when you're in labor and during birth. You're not at a place necessarily where you feel like you can advocate for yourself because there's so much else going on. So having somebody that can kind of help you, and I say that from a privileged point of view, like not everyone can afford a doula, but particularly in Massachusetts, I know that Mass Health covers some doulas now, and like some do like a sliding scale. So I think even just researching that and seeing if you can kind of get someone to help you advocate can make a difference too.
Healthy mom and healthy baby should be the bare minimum. And I think a lot of women are recognizing that it's not just about a healthy mom and a healthy baby. Birth is an empowering experience that we should own, right? So getting
Yeah.
pregnant and delivering a child, it's hard. And the reward is a healthy mom and a healthy baby, but also the empowerment that you walk away and the healing and the new journey and the transformation into motherhood. Those are all good things that we deserve to have. And I
Yeah.
remember reading some random quote saying, a woman empowered by birth is unstoppable, right? And we
Oh, I love
deserve to
that.
have that experience. One of the goals for this project is that we can hear from each other, not just from the providers who are taking care of us, that we can hear from each other, learn from each other, and grow. In that way, we go into the situations when it's time to have our children, that we're more informed, not just, like I said, from the providers, but from our peers, from sisterhood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your story and going into detail and opening up. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. I think particularly having like a traumatic birth, but any birth, I think it's such an experience. And after you have the baby, in the few days, people are like, "Oh, it's your birth experience." But like, even if you have like the textbook perfect birth, it's such an experience. There are so many layers that you don't even realize are there. And then I know, like for me, it feels like it gets to a point and you're like, "Oh, it feels like weird to bring up the birth now." It's just I love the opportunity to talk about it. In one way, it's like so many people do it and it happens every day. It's so wild and such a wild experience. I don't do it every day,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's getting the opportunity to talk about it and getting the opportunity to listen to other birth stories. Like I could talk about it all day. So like I really appreciate having that opportunity. It's like a therapy almost, and being able to talk about it and relive it and process it. So like I really appreciate what you're doing, and allowing me to come on and share my stories is really grateful. So thank you.
Of course. I'm glad to be able to create that space for you. We need this space. We need to heal. We need to grow and move forward in a more empowering way that we deserve.
Absolutely.
Please follow us on our social media platforms at maternal_wealth on Instagram and Maternal Wealth on Facebook. Visit our website at www.maternalwealth.com to sign up as a maternal wealth provider or search for maternal wealth providers near you. Lastly, check out our birth course, where I discuss how hospital staffing, policies, and access to medication can affect your birth experience and outcome. Stay strong, stay empowered, and remember, you got this.